Thank you very much. I'm Raymond Vergne, and I'm delighted to see all of you here, which is always very comforting to see people showing up for all these activities. So my compliments to you for taking time from your lives to come here and be entertained in this fashion. The topic will be that of the Vice Presidents of the United States. Where did the term buckets of warm spit come from? It came from one of the Vice Presidents themselves, John Nance Garner, who was one of FDR's Vice Presidents. And when he was asked, what's the Vice Presidency like? He had been Speaker of the House. So he had been used to being very, very powerful. Didn't you know that? I didn't know that either until I heard it. John Nance Garner said the Vice Presidency isn't worth a bucket of warm piss. But the press could not print that, so they printed warm spit. Well, that's the background of that. John Nance Garner had a way with words, having been Speaker of the House. Next, I'm always asked, what are your credentials? Why are you talking? Where did you come from? So I will now list my credentials and qualifications to teach this class. All right, that's it. We took care of that. Let's advise you that every week you will get electronically should we say, a narrative summary or a composition or a monograph about the following week's session. Did you all get the first one that was sent earlier this week? All right. Good. So if you miss a class or if you miss something, all of the information that is relevant is there. No doubt about it. All right, very well. All right. Try that one. Let's begin with the origins of the Vice Presidency. Where did the Vice Presidency come from? Richard Henry Lee was a delegate from Virginia to the second. Is it okay to stand here?
Yeah, absolutely.
But not here. No, all right?
You're fine. Stay careful.
I'll be obedient and I'll stay here. So Henry Lee was advised by his bosses in Virginia, you go to the Second Intercontinental Congress and you present a resolution that will have three parts. Number one, Declaration of Independence. Why? So that the world knows why we want to be independent of England. Number two, get some alliances going. And that meant France. France was supposed to be the ally in Europe. Why not Britain? Well, the United States were trying to withdraw from Britain. They didn't want us an ally. And the other thing was a plan for confederation. They realized that the colonies really needed to have some plan to work together. So the Articles of Confederation were approved by the Continental Congress and sent to the states in 1977. Now, it took almost 4 years to the Articles of Confederation to be approved by the states. You think we have problems nowadays when people can't get together on anything? Well, the problems arise from the very, very beginning of the nation. The Articles were not ratified until 1781. The Articles of Confederation were very, very weak. Why were they weak? because they were a result of compromises. And when you compromise, you give up your best so that the other party gives their best, and you end up finding common ground. So some of the weaknesses of the articles included taxation. The Congress could not tax directly people. Like right now, the government, the federal government taxes every single one of us directly, not through the states, not through the county, not through the city, directly. The federal government taxes our income directly to us. Federal government did not have that prerogative at that time. So the Continental Congress was always broke. It was always lacking in money, had no predictable income. Trade and commerce, the same thing. States were competing and fighting each other, literally fighting each other over things like fishing rights in the Chesapeake Bay, taxing vessels going from one state to another. So commerce was really a mess. There was no national military. In Congress, each state had one vote. Even though they may have had 7 or 8 or 20 representatives, each state in Congress under the Confederation had only one vote. One state, one vote. How could they come to a majority, let alone a supermajority? They needed a unanimous vote to change anything in the Confederation. So a vote had to be unanimous. Several times they tried to get something approved, but only one state was able to veto it. The only thing that the articles achieved was the organization of the Northwest Territory. Those 5 states, north of the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, those states were organized initially by the Continental Congress, by the Confederate Congress. There were no national courts, so there was really no judiciary. And most importantly, there was no executive branch. There was nobody to enforce the laws if any law was approved. Eventually, it was Virginia that once again took the initiative and called for a conference in Annapolis of the 13 colonies at that time. Only 5 attended. Half of them did not even show up. What happened? I don't know, bridge traffic, or they got lost on the Beltway, but half the delegates didn't show up. In any event, they said, look, we have problems, we need to address them. Let's have a meeting of all the states next year, where I'm tired of Annapolis. Let's go to Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia? It was a bigger city, communications by water, hotel rooms, bars, restaurants, meeting rooms. Why do people go to Las Vegas for meetings nowadays? Because all this stuff is there to begin with. So that was the whole idea that supported this meeting in Philadelphia. It was central and had the facilities necessary for a meeting. So this meeting was even approved by the Confederation Congress. Nowhere. You needed unanimous vote to approve anything. They said, sure, guys, go ahead, go meet. See if you can find any consensus. See if you can come up with anything that you will all agree on. Sure, be my guest. Go out there and try it. Feeling pretty certain it was not going to work. Well, 74 men were appointed as delegates to the Philadelphia Congress. and only 55 actually attended. When the Constitution was finalized, only 39 signed of the 77 or the 74 that were nominated. So there was never, where are we? There we are. There was never a majority. They assembled in Philadelphia. They came to agreement on George Washington being the president, and the fact that they needed to achieve checks and balances, 2 cameras or 2 chambers for the legislature, a strong executive, and a judiciary branch that was independent of the other 2. This is a photograph of the original hall in Independence Hall, where the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were signed. Pretty small. Do you remember the first time you went there and you saw this? What a small room this is. So tiny, so cozy. We had this envision of this enormous hall with benches all over. No, it was a very, very intimate atmosphere. There was a lot of discussion over the development of the Constitution. Generally, what they did was they brought things out in the open, and they had 2 plans. They had a large state plan, like Virginia, New York, and they had a small state plan, like New Jersey. There was a 3rd plan of government that was presented by Hamilton, but that was had certain monarchical ideas, and that was very promptly discarded. Like there was office for life. No, that's not what they had fought the British to get rid of. So that was promptly discarded, and that's how, if it had not been for the $10 bill, Hamilton would not have been in our history other than the musical. So the options were to have a single executive or an executive council. James Madison wanted to have an executive council rather than a single executive. Options for election: direct popular votes, appointment by the Congress, appointment by the state's legislatures, or appointments by the executive of the states. All of these things, all these combinations and permutations were considered. So what they did was they appointed committees to work out the details. All the details were worked out in committees, then brought into the assembly. And the assembly was declared a committee of the whole, which is good because they don't have to keep minutes when there is a committee of the whole, and people can speak freely because it is not an actual formal meeting. Nowadays, they call that executive council or executive meetings. Have you ever been on a board of directors where they say, okay, it's going to be an executive meeting, no minutes, whatever is said here stays here, period. The point is that these men were very, very particular about the words that they used. By and large, they were extremely careful because they wanted things to be specific and clear for everybody. Not just for a few, but for everybody. So they tried very, very hard to make things very, very explicit. Every item in the Constitution was discussed at least 3 times. And they came back over and over and over, even in the heat of the summer, to discuss things and to define exactly what they wanted. Then everything went to a committee of language or committee of prose, and they came up with the exact wording, brought it back to the assembly, and then they voted and approved. So it was a very, very thorough process. They also discussed the length of the term of office, re-election, veto powers, other powers of the executive. Everything was discussed in pretty much detail. They appointed a committee to decide how to vote in the executive. And the committee came up with what is called now the Electoral College. A group of electors selected by the legislatures of the states, not by the people. The ones who were going to choose the president, the executive of the nation, were a group selected by the legislature of these states, not by popular vote. The development into a more or less direct popular vote is rather new. So the electors would vote for two individuals without specifying who was going to be president and who was going to be vice president. Initially, they voted for two without naming which office they were going to occupy. The one with the most votes would be the president. The one with the second most votes would be the vice president. The background to this is that they had lieutenant governors in the states, like we still do. Many states, or most states, have lieutenant governors. So they were used to the fact that there was a backup there, rather available and ready to take office whenever there was a vacancy. Why elect a vice president, you may ask? Well, basically to facilitate succession in the case of death or resignation or exile. Exile was also mentioned at the time as a possibility that an executive would be exiled, and to provide stability. The stability of government was very important. And why vote for two candidates? With the proviso that at least one of them was not going to be from their own state. Easy to understand. The methods of communication at that time were very primitive. There was no email. There was no Instagram. There was no, none of these electronic things. There was no telephone, no television, nothing. So most people within their lives did not travel more than 50 miles away from where they lived. So in a way, people were largely quite parochial or quite insular, insulated themselves from the outside. Many people did not know anybody outside their state. So it was expected that every state would have their favorite son. Who would Maryland nowadays send to a national convention as a favorite son? Maybe the former governor that kind of everybody, a lot of people liked and respected. You get the idea? But beyond that, they hardly knew anybody. Nobody in Massachusetts knew much about many people in Georgia and vice versa. And with the states moving out west, even more so. So if they had the electors vote for one candidate only, all the states would vote for their favorite son. And there would be no winner. All right? That was the whole idea. Vote for two, one of which is not an inhabitant of your state. People would have to say, who do you know out there? Who can back up? Okay, you're going to vote for your favorite son. I'm going to vote for my favorite son. Who else can we vote for? People would have to get together and bring up other candidates of weight and worthiness. This way, they anticipated that candidates of caliber and stature would be nominated because the electors would have to confer with each other and coordinate their voting. That was the idea. Well, if you had to vote for two, then number one would be president and number two would be the vice president. Okay, what does he do? Or what does she do? And that's the issue. The Constitution very clearly read in Article 2, Section 1, that the administrative or executive power of the United States would be vested in one president. No word about the vice president. So the vice president constitutionally has no powers. The vice president is able to preside over the Senate. Why? Why did they give him that position? There was nothing else to do. They had to give him something. Actually, the first Congress debated whether to allow for a stipend for the vice president. Are we going to pay the vice president anything? It was actually debated. They did not want to pay him anything. Why? Because he did nothing. Out of nothing, you get nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, you get nothing. The vice president did get to cast a deciding vote, but only if the vote was tied. And this was anticipated because originally the Senate was rather small, like 26 individuals. And they were independent thinking individuals. Therefore, it was foreseen that close votes or tie votes would occur. And the vice president would be able to decide those votes. The other thing that the vice president does once every 4 years is to preside over the confirmation of votes, like on January 6th. At that time, we need to point this out because the vice presidency developed in this direction. There were no parties. Political parties developed during the presidency of George Washington. They were predicted, they were anticipated. They knew that eventually people would polarize into different parties. Not as polarized as we are experiencing them now, but still, there would be people moving in different directions. There was a Federalist Party and a Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party was the party of John Adams, party of Alexander Hamilton. It was primarily New England based. They wanted a strong central government, protective tariffs, that is, taxes on imports from outside the country, strict immigration policies. You thought that this was a new item? No, it's been going for hundreds of years. Strength was in cities, and they anticipated and they envisioned an urban country with government of the few. That was the concept of the Federalist Party. On the other hand, Jefferson, Madison, and others were the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party. It was based in border states and in the South, as opposed to the Federalist Party that was in the Northeast. They were all for state sovereignty, against tariffs, against the Bank of the United States. They wanted liberal immigration policies and a country with a government of the many rather than a government of the few. This would be very similar to the Democratic Party in the southern states during the Civil War. In the election of 1796, all the electors got together and they voted for two individuals, number one and number two. So what happened was that John Adams was elected president and Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president. They belonged to different parties. They had two totally opposite views of things. One had all the executive power, one had absolutely none. So that was the first problem that developed. Jefferson was a good guy. He kind of waited out, said, you might be president now, enjoy it. I'll be vice president. I'll sit in the Senate and do nothing. But I'll be back. I'll be president. Just give me time. So he waited around for 4 years, and in the election of 1800, Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both Democratic Republicans, were elected. What happened? Jefferson and Burr were very good politicians, particularly Burr. Burr was an outstanding politician, as I hope we'll be able to discuss later on. They went around to all the states and secured votes from the electors. You vote for Jefferson and for Burr. You vote for Jefferson and for Burr. Burr had a lot of connections in New York State and was able to deliver New York State to the Democratic Republicans. It worked out too well. It worked out so well that both Jefferson and Burr ended up with the same number of votes. At that time, they did not vote for president and for vice president. They voted, period. So they ended up with the same number of votes. Who is vice president? Who is president? Everybody knew that the top man in the ticket was Jefferson. But the Constitution didn't say that. The Constitution said if the vote is tied, the vote goes to the House. And in the House, a vote is taken for one state, one vote. And who had the majority in the House? Not the Democratic Republicans, but the Federalists. It could not have been a worse scenario. But it took them like 3 months and 50-some votes to finally decide that Jefferson was going to be president and Aaron Burr vice president. Aaron Burr probably tried to get himself elected president. Not too hard, just enough to satisfy his ambition. He had run for vice president before, and he had come in fourth. But he was already by then a well-known individual, particularly in the Northeast. So the original plan failed in 1796 and again failed in 1800. And then came the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment in 1804 made the Electoral College vote specifically for men for vice president and for men for president. That was a key thing in the history of the vice presidents. What happened then? The problem was that up until then, it did not matter who was running as long as they were men of caliber and worth. After the 12th Amendment, they could nominate anybody for vice president because it was the president, the one that was getting the votes. So the caliber of men elected to the vice presidency decreased to the point that the vice presidential nomination was used as a reward for a politician who had been in the party for many years, or to balance the ballot. If one individual was too conservative, the other one should be liberal. If one was from the north, the other one should be from the south or the middle states. You get the idea. One and one. Do you remember Goldwater in 1964? Goldwater was very, very, very conservative. When he was nominated, who was his vice president? It's a very, very obscure congressman from New York who was very, very liberal. At that time, there were very liberal Republicans. Again, question of trying to balance the budget, not the budget, but the ideology of the candidates. John Kennedy and LBJ in 1960. Kennedy was from the north, from Massachusetts. LBJ was from the south, from Texas. LBJ could also help deliver Texas to the Democrats, and that probably worked at that time. So they also tried to secure the electoral votes of a key state, and this is what we just described there. So through the 19th century, most vice presidents, because they really did not hold any power, they had no influence, they were largely nobodies, were ignored or marginalized or totally put aside by the president and the cabinet, including some of our greatest heroes like Lincoln. Hopefully we'll get to that in another cycle, but Hannibal Hamlin, who was a very, very able politician, was totally ignored by Lincoln, absolutely ignored by Lincoln. All executive power was vested in one person, the president. And there was also a question whether the vice president was a member of the executive or the Congress or the legislative branch. Up until the 20th century, the vice president had offices in the Capitol with the lawmakers, not in the White House or in the executive office building. Richard Johnson, who was vice president in the 1830s, took his oath of office on March 4th, attended a few parties, drank his share, and then retired to his state. I think he was from Tennessee or from Kentucky. And he ran a saloon for 9 months. He returned to Washington in December for the next session of Congress. This is what vice presidents did at that time. They were nothing. They were not even expected to be in Washington at that time. So all these things led to several attempts at actually eliminating the vice presidency by constitutional amendment. There have been several times when there has been enough momentum politically to try to eliminate the vice presidency. Efforts at utilizing the vice president for various projects, a good idea, that has not worked. Why? Because there's always a conflict with somebody else in the administration. You cannot have two bosses, a vice president and a secretary, trying to deal with the same thing. This is why all these efforts with the vice president and the southern border haven't gotten to anything. Why? The vice president doesn't have any executive power. Number two, whatever the vice president says, does, or thinks comes in conflict with the appropriate secretary of the area. So it's really constitutionally it's a miserable office. So it was really in the middle of the 20th century that the vice presidency became a desirable office. Let's go through some of the hallmarks here. In 1921, Warren Harding invited Coolidge to become a member of the cabinet. and attend all meetings. Up until then, the vice president did not attend any cabinet meetings and was not informed of anything that was going on. 1921. In 1925, Charles Dawes declined the cabinet invitation. He said, no, I'm not going to attend any meetings. He was a character, as we will eventually see. He liked to be in Washington, Mr. Dawes, for the partying and for the social events and for the hosting and this and that. But he knew that he had nothing to do, and guess what? He did nothing. FDR established the vice president's attendance at cabinet meetings in the 1930s. Still, when FDR died, Truman knew nothing about the H-bomb, about the A-bomb, nothing about the Manhattan Project. Or he knew that there was something called a Manhattan Project, the same way that there were dozens and dozens of other projects. But he had never been briefed on such an enormous project. In 1949, and this was by law, the vice president became a member of the National Security Council, which is, of course, always advisory. Not executive, just advisory. 1961, Lyndon Johnson was granted office space in the executive office building right next to the White House. Here's the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue here. And it took even to almost modern times for it to get just offices in the executive office building. Later on, the vice president was awarded its own budget allowance. Before that, he was taking money from somebody else. And it was revised in 1974. Where does the vice president live? Live at number 1 Observatory Circle, which used to be the residence of the Chief of Staff of the Navy, the CNO. But they took that perk away from the Navy and gave it to the vice president. It was revamped extensively during the Bush-Cheney years, and rumor has it that it's now equipped with its own intensive care unit. Walter Mondale occupied offices in the West Wing first in 1977 and was able to receive briefings and attend all meetings. Well, it took a while, little by little, for the vice presidency to assume more and more, not powers, but presence in government. All right. Now, the vice presidency underwent another crisis in the second part of the 20th century, beginning with the assassination of John Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson became president, and there was no vice president for over a year. The office was just vacant after Kennedy was assassinated. Later on, Spiro Agnew was elected vice president and then re-elected in '74, only to resign in 1974. So one more vice president is out. Another event was when Eagleton was nominated for vice president by the Democrats, and he was found to have had depression, clinical depression, and had undergone electroshock therapy for depression. That is really only used for people who are about to die. It's a very, very, it works. It works, but it's not a treatment that is used readily, not a first-line management. So this was quite a scandal in 1972, to the point that he had to be withdrawn from the ticket, and that really distracted a lot from the campaign. Vice President Agnew resigned in 1974. That was another insult to the vice presidency. Ford became the first vice president not to be elected, and then the first president not to be elected either. Nelson Rockefeller was appointed and confirmed. So in the 1970s, various individuals and organizations advocated doing away with the vice presidency altogether. If the president resigns or dies or whatever, we can get somebody else to act as president. The president pro tem of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Secretary of State. We can find somebody to act for president, as president, until there is a new election. And that was in the laws at that time, as we will see. So there were really a number of succession plans, including an interim election. We have never faced that. There has never been an interim election in between the 4 years, but it has been in the laws as being possible. Then came Reagan and his assassination attempt in 1981. And he underwent surgery several times afterwards. And that brought to the limelight the desirability of having a successor there ready to go. So this incident, or these incidents, really did away with the plans to eliminate the vice presidency. The calls for the abolition of the vice presidency subsided because people wanted some kind of stability in the government. Okay, we love our president. If he dies or moves away or resigns or something, we want to have somebody else we trust right there and ready to go. Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman to be nominated for vice president by the Democratic Party in 1984. That was great until they found out about her husband, Joe Sacaro. Joe Sacaro was a businessman in New York with a few shady angles here and there. And when these became known, it was a really major scandal. This really diverted attention during the campaign. So instead of asking questions about issues or programs or approaches, they kept asking about your husband and his business activities and who did he bribe and what methods did he use to achieve what he did. So it was all very, very distracting. At that time, I was taking a class at Duquesne University on the current election. And instead of discussing the issues, we kept discussing this same thing over and over and over and over again. Sarah Palin was chosen by John McCain in 2008. No question, she was very, very photogenic. She had worked on television. And she had been a reporter, and she knew how to look at the camera and how to pose and how to position herself. She was very charismatic and photogenic, but she didn't have depth at the federal level. And that also contributed to losing the election. Then Vice President Harris was elected in 2020 when President Biden chose to promise or promised to choose a woman of color. The modern vice presidency was changed with Richard Cheney. Regardless of what you think about his politics, whether you agree with him, not agree with him, despise him, whatever, he had extensive experience as far as being a manager an executive, a politician. He had been in the White House, in Congress. He had been Secretary of Defense. He knew people all over the world. It is felt that at times he functioned as a co-president. And he filled in quite well the gaps that President Bush had. Now, why can't they give the vice president something to do? Well, it's been tried. FDR in the 1940s appointed Henry Wallace, who was vice president, chairman of the Board of Economic Warfare. Well, Wallace was a very able politician. He was also very liked. He was congenial. He got along with the people. He got along with the press. He was all right. But he immediately ran into conflict with the head of the War Production Board, Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Commerce. In the end, a number of people resigned, a number of boards were dissolved, things fell apart miserably. Why? Because you got two alpha males trying to achieve the same thing, and that does not work. The vice president is the only federal employee that the president cannot discharge. He is there for the long run. Everybody else, the president can discharge because they serve at the pleasure of the president. Not the vice president has to wait 4 years. We need to talk about the Presidential Succession Acts. These are the laws that were made by Congress in order to provide for a double vacancy. That is those times when the president is gone or absent or resigned and there is no vice president. Or the vice president also resigns, like happened to Spiro Agnew. This goes back to 1792. That's a long time. By law, it was decided that in case of a double vacancy, the president pro tem, for a period of time, pro tempore, of the Senate would become acting president until a new president was elected by a temporary election, by an interim election. This was the original Presidential Succession Act. Next will be the Speaker of the House. You can see all the problems that created. The president pro tem of the Senate may be a legislator, or is a legislator. It's not an executive. He or she may be of a different party than the president. So that may turn around the direction of government altogether. A president like Reagan, for example, was elected and was very popular, but dealt with a Congress of the opposite party. Most often, the president pro tem is a senior member of the Senate, somebody who has been there for a long time. Why? Maybe because he came from a district that was safe, and he kept getting reelected term after term after term after term, almost automatically. So you see that this concept, even though it's practical, it's not perfect. So those are the various criticisms. After the Civil War and after the assassination of President Garfield, well, if I move here like this, you can see me moving there. It gets kind of dizzy, doesn't it? I better stand. All right. So the assassination of President Garfield brought together a new Presidential Succession Act in 1886. And what happened was that the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House were thrown out of the succession list. Initially, it was first the President pro tem, then the Speaker of the House. Now they did away with that. The other issue was that the Speaker of the House does not have to be a member of the House. It can theoretically be a third party, not a legislator. So that could permit a non-elected official to become president. And there was word recently about doing that to a candidate, elect a candidate, Speaker of the House, and eventually become president. So that was another criticism. In 1886, the line of succession would be the members of the cabinet, state, treasury, defense down the line. And the special election, the interim election, was maintained. So that interim election was on for over 150 years, but it was never used. An interim election was never held. After FDR died and Harry Truman became president, a new Succession Act was approved, which stated that in the case of a double vacancy, the Speaker of the House would be the first in line, then the President pro tem, then the members of the cabinet. And this is what exists now. Originally, it was the President pro tem of the Senate, then the Speaker of the House. Next would be the cabinet. Next and now would be Speaker of the House and then the President of the Senate. But the special election was discarded. A special election nowadays would not occur. All right, so that proviso of the law was discarded in 1947. Eventually, the 25th Amendment corrected all that by allowing the president to nominate a vice president subject to the approval of the legislature. Let's look at some of the statements that vice presidents have said about the vice presidency. Forgive me if I sit down. This was Arthur Schlesinger, prominent historian, who said that the vice president has only one serious thing to do, and that is to wait around for the president to die. Pretty straightforward, kind of crude, but very realistic. I hope that by now you get the idea that the vice president, or if you choose to say the poor vice president, really has very, very little weight and very, very, very little constitutional responsibilities and no authority in the Constitution. And that has to be made very, very clear. John Adams, way back in the 18th century, I am nothing, but I may be everything. He also had a way with words. Being vice president, I am nothing, but something happens, I could be or become everything. Daniel Webster, who was Secretary of State and probably the most well-spoken legislator ever, when he was offered the vice presidency, he said, I do not propose to be buried until I am dead and in my coffin. In other words, don't offer me something that is the equivalent of political death. Woodrow Wilson says that the importance of the vice president consists in the fact that he may cease to be vice president and become president. So by itself, the vice presidency, in the opinion of Wilson, had no value. Ted Roosevelt said it's not a stepping stone to anything except oblivion. And he accepted the position, and he accepted that premise. But lo and behold, he did become president and changed history. John Nance Garner was the one who quoted the title of this exercise. And he also says that the vice presidency is a spare tire in the automobile of government. He had a way with words. Marshall, who was vice president to Woodrow Wilson, said the vice president is a man in a cataleptic state. He cannot speak, he cannot move, he suffers no pain, yet he is perfectly conscious of everything that is going on about him. Very, very frustrating for men in that position. Truman thought that the vice president was not an officer of the executive branch, even though the vice president's office is included in Article 2 of the Constitution, which is dedicated to the executive branch. And remember that at that time, Truman was delegated out to the president of the Senate's offices. So he felt like he was a member of the legislative branch of government and not of the executive branch. Eisenhower noted that the vice president is not legally a part of the executive branch and not subject to direction by the president. Eisenhower was very, very hard on Nixon. Extremely hard. Very humiliating a number of times. Only LBJ was worse to Hubert Humphrey than Eisenhower to Nixon. They once asked him, Mr. President Eisenhower, can you tell us of any decision that Vice President Nixon has made? And he said, well, if you give me a week, I could come up with something. Very, very, very insulting and humiliating. Hubert Humphrey himself, who took a lot of you know what from LBJ, said that the vice presidency is like being naked in the middle of a blizzard. Coming from Minnesota, he knew that. With no one to even offer you a match to keep you warm, you're trapped, vulnerable, and alone. That's a brief history of the vice presidency. In the let's see, we should be able to finish up. We have a few minutes for comments. Any comments you'd like to bring up?
Just a question. When Wilson had his stroke and was incapacitated for the last year or year and a half of his presidency, and his wife basically took over, would that be allowed to happen today?
Excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. The issue was when Woodrow Wilson took his stroke in about 1920, and he was paralyzed and he could not function. His wife protected him from the press, from the Congress, from everything. And she basically ran the executive for almost a year. Could that have happened today? Probably not. Probably not. The 25th Amendment notes that the Vice President, together with the members of the cabinet, can inform the Congress if the President is not able to perform the duties of the office. And he can then become acting President. Not President, acting President, until the President is able to recover. Probably would not happen today because he was just absolutely, he was all locked out, like we used to say in New York. He was totally paralyzed. And he could not carry any of his functions. It was known how he was. The vice president knew how bad Wilson was impaired, but he did not want to appear ambitious by challenging that publicly. But the country survived. The country survived. Let's talk about Aaron Burr, and then we'll be right on time. Aaron Burr was the third vice president of the United States, excuse me. Burr was born in Newark, mid-century, and came from a very educated and intelligent family. His father was president of what became Princeton University, and his grandfather was also president of the same institution. So he came from a family with brains. He was no dummy. He went to college as a teenager and completed his college degree at age 16. His parents had died when he was 3, so he and his sister were raised by foster families. But he still had outstanding genetics. He joined the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and served showing great spirit and resolution. Those assessments have survived and are firm. He was promoted to captain and joined George Washington's staff. Probably there was when he met Alexander Hamilton. Those were two alpha males, again, going against each other. In his service in the Army, while he was at Valley Forge, he probably saved an entire brigade from being exterminated. But do you think George Washington gave him a promotion or a commendation or a thanks or a well done or a thumbs up? No. Apparently there was no love lost between George Washington and Burr, or with Burr and Alexander Hamilton. All these men just did not like each other. In the 1770s, he withdrew from the Army and resigned his commission on account of poor health. How bad was his health? His health was so poor that he lived for another 56 years. That's how sick he was. But he resigned his commission and practiced law in New York City, married, started a family. He also became active in politics. As a young man, he was elected to the New York State Assembly in Albany. Then he was appointed Attorney General and eventually to the U.S. Senate in 1791. At that time, the elections were at large. Candidates did not belong to a specific district like they are now. So in a place like the Eastern Shore, instead of having a candidate from this part of the state and that part of the state or that part of the state, potentially all the candidates, all the representatives could come from, say, Baltimore. All right, because they were elected at large. That was common at that time. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that candidates to the United States Senate were appointed by the legislature. So they were responsible to their state's legislatures. They were not voted separately to the Senate until 1913. So throughout the 19th century, senators responded not to the voters, but to their legislatures. All right, that's something that needs to be made very, very clear. And that was the original intention of the Constitution. Two chambers, the House of Representatives responsive to the people, the Senate responsive to the states, which is a formula accepted by many constitutions in many places outside by the United States. Two chambers, one responsive to the people, one responsive to the states. So Aaron Burr had been considered as a candidate for president and vice president way back at the end of the 18th century, when they used to vote for two instead of one and one. He came in fourth. So by that time, by 1796, Aaron Burr was pretty well known, not only in his state, but in his region and probably throughout the closer states. More about Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was one of the founders of the Manhattan Company. The Manhattan Company was a chartered company that was given the responsibility of bringing clean, potable water to New York City. That was the idea. That was in their charter. The idea of this company is to issue bonds and shares and whatnot, collect money and build aqueducts to supply the growing city of New York with fresh water. That way we will have less malaria, we will have less cholera, we will have less typhus and other things. So this is what they did. Aaron Burr was one of the founders of the Chase Manhattan Company, and Alexander Hamilton, his nemesis, was also a stockholder. They both owned shares in this company. The Bank of Manhattan was organized with excess funds from the Manhattan Company. That is, the company that was organized to bring water in had excess funds, and in the charter, they had written in small print, the company can also engage in other activities of benefit to the city if excess funds are available. So sure enough, they had some extra money. What did they do? They formed the Manhattan, or the Bank of Manhattan, that eventually became the Chase Manhattan Bank. That's the whole idea behind the Chase Manhattan Bank. So these men were stockholders with interest in two companies, the Bank of Manhattan and the Manhattan Company. The Bank of Manhattan was in competition with the Bank of New York and the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was the child of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the one that really organized the economics of the young nation. And one of his ideas was a Bank of the United States. You may think, well, what's the big idea of the Bank of the United States? What's wrong with it? Number one, it was for profit. So people would go buy stock, buy shares, put down their money, and the bank would issue out dividends and interest on those shares. So it was a money-making activity that benefited who? The ones who had money. Not everybody, but the ones who had money. The other thing was that the Bank of the United States was chartered by the United States, not by a state. So it operated directly and above and beyond the influence of the states. The states could not tell the Bank of the United States what to do, what rates to set, what loans to make, how to operate. No, because it was under a federal, not a state charter. And that always created a lot of friction. So the Bank of Manhattan also made loans to small businessmen. Small businessmen took their loans, they bought property. And when they bought property, what happened? They became voters. At that time, you had to own property to be able to vote, which to us is something extraordinary and unfathomable. How can we accept this, that you had to own property to vote? That's the history of our nation. Election time comes around and says, oh, remember the loan that gave you, voted, you built up your business with it? How about giving us some support? And this was in New York, which was primarily a federalist city, being in the northern part of the nation. So that's how they helped elect Democratic Republican candidates. Remember, the Democratic Republicans had their strength in the South, middle states and in the South. New York at that time was the battleground state. So by having all these people that had received loans from the Bank of Manhattan vote for candidates that were supportive of the Democratic Republicans, that really turned a lot of elections. This is the bank at number 40 Wall Street. Hamilton, of course, felt that Burr had deceived everybody, did to an extent, legally, but did, with the Manhattan Company and the Bank of Manhattan. So that's one more episode in the conflict between these two men. We already spoke about the election of 1800 when Burr was elected with Thomas Jefferson because he could deliver the electoral votes of New York State. New York State voted for the assemblymen who would appoint electors loyal to their candidates. Now look at the Greens are the ones that Jefferson won. The ones in pink are the ones that Adams won. And the difference turns out to be the 12 electoral votes of New York. So in this case, the strategy worked by selecting Aaron Burr as the running mate of Jefferson. Burr could deliver in northern states to the Democratic Republicans. And that's how it works. Note, please, New York has 12 electoral votes. Okay, 12. Keep that in mind, 12, 12, 12. The electoral votes, Jefferson 73, Burr 73, Adams 65, Pinckney 64. Remember the 12? Take 12 from 73. 61. Add 12 to 65. 77. Who wins? Adams. So the way things worked out, the strategy was correct. You get Burr in to deliver the 12 electoral votes of New York State and the Democratic Republicans, that is Jefferson and Burr, get elected. The election had to be decided in the House, like we said, but the Federalists had a majority in the House of Representatives. And at that time, may I refresh your memory, each state had one vote, regardless of how many representatives they had. Look at Virginia. Virginia had 21 representatives. How many votes? One. Look at Maine. No, but Massachusetts had 12 or so. One. Delaware had 3. How many votes in the House? 1. The same thing with all the other states. Each state had 1 vote and no more, regardless of how many representatives and senators they had. So
why didn't the Federalists just select Adams?
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, why didn't the Federalists, since they could control the same more states, why didn't they just select Adams and disregard that?
There was a lot of pulling and going in there. No, they could not do that. That's it.
Okay.
They could not. I'm sure if they could have, they would have. They could not elect Adams. No. So Burr may have tried to win the election, but he never openly challenged Jefferson. Hamilton, who was in the other party, favored Jefferson and made a lot of remarks about Aaron Burr. Jefferson eventually was elected, but never trusted Burr again. Burr was fine for the election. Once it was decided, out of mind, out of sight. So Burr would never be a candidate for the vice presidency again. He was a pretty good vice president, the books say. He presided over the Senate, the impeachment of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. He was a character, Samuel Chase. He didn't do anything wrong, but he did things in an odd fashion. He would declare openly what was his opinion of a case even before a trial began. He was somewhat of an oddball, but anyway, he was impeached but not removed. Aaron Burr tried to get elected governor of New York since he knew that he was going nowhere after being vice president. He didn't make it, but during the campaign, there was a dinner party when Alexander Hamilton really said some nasty things about Burr. Burr was not there, but somebody wrote a letter copying what Hamilton had said. And the letter eventually got to Burr, and Burr asked for a retraction, which was the polite thing to do at that time, and an apology. These two men would never apologize for anything. And we know politicians in our own lifetime that will not apologize for anything at all. Anyway, the issue escalated and eventually it came to a duel. The duel occurred in New Jersey in the middle of the summer. Duels were illegal in both states, New York and New Jersey, but the penalties for dueling in New Jersey were less than in New York. So they crossed the river and dueled in New Jersey. The pistols were chosen by Hamilton with a larger bore than usual, and the trigger was adjusted to require less pressure. So the pistols were doctored to 80 degrees. Burr was not hurt. It is really not certain who shot first, but they both did. Hamilton was hit above the right hip, injuring his bowels, the liver, and the spine. The injuries were fatal. He died the next day over on the other side of the river in New York. After the duel, Burr he traveled for several months, and then he came back to Washington, D.C., he came back to the swamp to finish his term as vice president. At that time, he was wanted for murder in New York State, but he was never arrested. Yet he could go to Washington, D.C. and preside over the Senate and finish off his term. Now, whatever happened afterwards is well known, but not fully understood. So a number of interpretations are acceptable in history. Burr traveled from western Pennsylvania to New Orleans by the rivers as soon as his term was completed, that is, the following spring. Burr had leased 4,000 acres of land in what is now Louisiana, which at that time was Spanish. It was not part of the United States at that time, west of the Mississippi. So it was not federal government or state government or any kind of government. It was another country. He had leased land there legally. On his trip, he made the acquaintance of this character, Harmon Blennerhassett. Blennerhassett owned an island on the Ohio River that is now part of West Virginia, between West Virginia and Ohio. And apparently, Aaron Burr talked to Blennerhassett and said, listen, Blennerhassett, would it be possible for me and my associates to store a few things here? Maybe if a few men came over, could they camp on your island? They can bring home their own food and liquor and internet and everything else. You don't have to pay for any of that. And Blennerhassett said, yeah, sure. Blennerhassett was an immigrant and was not very smart politically. So he said, the Vice President of the United States comes to my island and asks me if he can use some of it. Yeah, I don't see why not. Sure. Want to store some of your stuff here? Here, sure. Okay, do that. He kept on going, and he wrote, Aaron Burr, to Anthony Merry. Anthony Merry was the ambassador or the minister of England, the United Kingdom, to the United States. So he was a prominent foreign diplomat. He told Anthony Merry that he was planning to develop, found, organize a country west of the Mississippi River that would be friendly to England. He didn't say that it would be unfriendly to the United States, just that he would be unfriendly to England. At that time, England did not want the United States to acquire any more territory. England feared that the United States would acquire the whole of Mexico, the whole of the Caribbean, the whole of the Isthmus. There were great fears that the United States would push in that direction. So the theory goes that he was just testing the grounds, doing a reconnaissance trip to find out whether it was at all possible to acquire more land in that direction should war break out with Spain. That was the key. If there was war with Spain, Aaron Burr would push in west of the Mississippi and secure land with which to build a new republic. He would go there with an army of armed farmers that would have been stationed in Blennerhassett Island. London really did not believe that he was going to get anywhere, so they ignored the area. So this is the Louisiana Purchase, and this is the area west of the Mississippi that we're talking about. Mississippi Territory, the states, the Northwest Territory. So it was not land that belonged to the United States. It was land that at that time belonged to Spain first and to France. Burr also contacted Generals James Wilkinson, who happened to be military governor of Louisiana, for help in case war broke out with Spain. What Burr did not know was that General Wilkinson was a double agent. He was a double agent for Spain too, and he was in cahoots with everybody else. So spy versus spy went on, and it is felt generally that something like this may have happened, or at least part of this may happen. That Burr wanted to occupy lands in the Southwest, then have New York and New Jersey secede from the Union, which is not a new concept. The northeastern states were trying to secede from the Union, even from the origin of the United States. It was the northeastern states that contemplated this union and secession much more than the southern states. So this is not a bizarre idea. They would join several Canadian provinces and form an independent entity. This is where Blennerhassett's Island is in the Ohio River, Lake Erie, Cleveland, Cincinnati down here. So you get the idea. So when Burr took a second trip, Wilkinson, the double agent, notified the authorities, and the federal government sent a force that destroyed Blennerhassett Island. Absolutely leveled it. Absolutely destroyed everything they could find. And they found nothing. Just a few men living in a camp with their muskets, farm products, but no artillery, no ammunition, no nothing ready to wage war. Nothing legal. But poor Blennerhassett, his property was decimated. And you think the federal government made good on that? No way. Burr was finally tried for treason in Richmond with a number of very important people: Edmund Randolph, Luther Martin, who was one of the writers of the Constitution, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He had sent a letter to Wilkinson that was coded, but Wilkinson, the dummy, he had rewritten the letter and copied it, but could not come up with the original. He offered evidence that he really had no weight. So, of course, the case collapsed because treason could not be proved. It was at this time that Jefferson, who was president, may have been summoned by the court, but he invoked executive privilege and never testified. So this may be the first time that a president invoked executive privilege. So afterwards, Burr lived in Europe for several years, went back to New York, married a wealthy woman, spent her money until she abandoned him, and then he finally died dead, and this is his death mask. Quite an interesting life for a vice president of the United States. That will be the end of this session. Next session, we will talk about John C. Calhoun, who was one of the heroes and anti-heroes of the South during the early part of the 19th century. You had a word?
I was just going to thank you.
Thank you, and we will send the narrative tonight or tomorrow. You'll get it.
Thank you.
Thank you for being so good.